Well, friends, it has been a minute since we've done an episode of the Watchdog. And since the new year is getting started, I decided that maybe we could try and do this podcast again. So, on today's episode, we're not going to be reading any articles. We're just going to be giving some general thought about some things that have been going on in the. Ooh, I don't like that. Anyway, let's just go ahead and jump into that. And I think that means it's intro time. All right. Let's go ahead and I just noticed because I turned that on that I still have my TV on. Let's go ahead and turn that off for now. Also, didn't set up this camera particularly well. What do you expect? It's been a while. Shalom, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of The Watchdog. I'm your host, CJ Cox, here to tell you that we are living in biblical times, and indeed the times get more and more and more biblical as time goes on, which seems to be a little bit of a trend, I guess, right? That's just the way things tend to go. Didn't want to do a standard episode per se today. Just kind of want to go over, what we can expect in the following year and some of my thoughts on recent sociopolitical controversies. We might read a couple articles here and there and all that kind of good, good and fun jazz. Maybe give you some updates on everything that's going on in Israel and stuff like that. But it's just been a while, and so that's essentially why we're doing this episode today. Is that it has been a while, and I wanted to let you guys know this channel is not defunct. Now, let me give you a couple reasons why it's been a while. Now, I know with a lot of you guys, because some of you guys watch both my apologetics / theology channel, The Synagogue, as well as this channel. And so some of you already know what's been going on. But for those of you who only watch this channel or who have just not heard me say anything on the other channel, life has gotten incredibly busy for me recently. And that's why I haven't been able to do these shows as much as I would like. I have gone back to school. I'm going to college now. Pursuing degrees currently in philosophy and history. Of course, I've only done the one semester, so you can't be claiming any expertise or anything like that thus far. But nevertheless, I have been pursuing these degrees, and once I end up having a little bit more free time, I'll be pursuing a degree in theology as well. But of course, pursuing 3 at one time while also working a full-time job is just not really sustainable, right? It's also just probably not financially sustainable as well, because you can do the philosophy and the history degree at one school, i.e. paying one tuition, right? Can't do that with a theology degree. You got to go to a different school to get the theology degree. And a lot of the schools in my area are rather liberal, so I might even have to relocate for the theology degree, at least for a small period of time. So we'll see what ends up happening with that. But anyways, that has created a lot more busyness, right? Also, I have been writing a second book. It is another Christian work on the birth of Jesus Christ. Whether or not it took place on December 25th, I am actually going to be arguing that it did take place on December 25th. So that has been taking up much of my time. I have been making music recently. Some of you guys follow me on a third channel I have where I publish my rap music. I have been making music. Maybe I'll even show you guys the most recent track we came out with today. So that has been taking up a lot of my time. And of course, I still do work a full-time job. I am still a married man who has family obligations, and I am actually expecting my first child here in the coming months. So that has been another thing that has been taking up quite a bit of my time. And then the stuff that was already taking up time, like these shows, learning Hebrew language, Bible studies, going to church, stuff like that. So that's where I've been, right? That's what's been taking up so much of my time. Unfortunately, I always knew this was coming. I expected that I would be a lot further along in my career, to be frank. Unfortunately, that just hasn't happened, right? I've only published the one book, 15 Questions for Calvinists Answered. It sold 43, I believe, copies. Was not that much. The second book, which I expected to get out 2 years ago, this Christmas one, has just taken me a lot more time to get out than I initially anticipated. Obviously the Patreons have not been as successful as I initially thought. And so basically I was expecting to have more free time by the time we got to this point. And I just didn't. And of course, the Lord's will be done. That's just the way it goes, right? But because of that, I have been spending less time on YouTube. I'm only publishing maybe once a week on the other channel, and on this channel, I don't think we've published in like 6 months. It's been a minute, right? So yeah, that's a little bit of where I have been. I'm looking right now to see when the last time we did publish was. It was, August the 1st. So it has been a while. But beyond that, we're here, right? And there have been a lot of sociopolitical issues that I want to discuss, and that I haven't had an opportunity to discuss because of the fact that we haven't been publishing to this channel. So really quickly, before I get to that, please remember to like and share this video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Hit that bell to get notified every time that we go live. Leave any questions, comments, criticisms, concerns, critiques, or anything of that nature in the comment section down below. I would say if you're here with us live, drop them in the live chat, but I don't actually read the live chat here on the Watchdog. So, use the live chat, comment. I don't think I have super chats available here too, so I can't say, I'll do them if there's super chat, because I don't think they're actually available on this channel. You can follow me on the various social media platforms, right? Gab, Twix, Facebook, Dalai Lama, I don't know. All the different ones. And of course, if you want to give to the Patreon or anything like that, you can certainly do so. Although if you're not wanting to give to the Synagogue News Patreon because of the fact that we don't post as much on here, I certainly do understand that. We also like to give a This Day in History fun fact when we start these things. I'm not going to do a This Day in History fun fact. I'm instead going to say Merry Christmas to those in Orthodox countries who use a Julian Orthodox calendar. They celebrate December 25th just like we do. It's just that they use a Julian calendar. And on the Julian calendar, December 25th is 13 days after December 25th on our Gregorian calendar. For those who do not know, that is because basically the Julian calendar was constructed in such a way, not intentionally, but this is just a pitfall of it, that it loses a day once every 180 or some odd years. Or in other words, it falls behind the solar calendar, which is the amount of time it takes for the sun to go around the Earth to go around the sun. It falls behind one day, roughly every 180 years. And so now it's 13 days behind the Gregorian calendar, which thus far aligns near perfectly with the solar calendar. It'll eventually lose a day. I think it's once every like 3,000 years, I believe, something along those lines. 1582 is when they started using the Gregorian calendar. That would mean, provided we didn't fix the problem before this, that we would lose a day 4482. It's a really long time. None of us are going to be around then, right? But nevertheless, so, that's why they're celebrating it today. But there's your little fun fact. The Orthodox celebrate Christmas on January 7th, not because they have a different day for Jesus' birth, but because they use a different calendar, and their calendar falls behind our calendar roughly one day every 180 years. So not a fun history fact, but kind of, right? Little bit. Involves calendrical stuff, and that is related to history. Anyway, there are a couple of things I wanted to comment on today, like I said, just to get the year started. And we're going to start with commentary on the Christian nationalism issues that have been happening recently. So, for those of you who do not know, there are a lot of people, especially but not exclusively in Reformed camps who are pushing what they refer to as Christian nationalism. And I'm sure most of you are aware of this already, but it's, of course, possible that many of you are actually not aware of this already. And, it started with, well, there were numerous different people, right? A couple politicians like Doug Mastriano and Lauren Boebert. I think that's how you say her name. Marjorie Taylor Greene, right? A lot of these guys started claiming, actually, sure, you guys in the media want to refer to us as Christian nationalists. Sure, we are Christian nationalists. And of course, the Moscow movement up in Moscow, Idaho, has been trying to turn Moscow into a Christian town for decades at this point. So they readily adopted the phrase Christian nationalism as well. Well, then I believe it was 2022, but it may have been last year. I guess I'd have to say 2 years ago now at this point, right? 2023. But nevertheless, Stephen Wolfe published his book, The Case for Christian Nationalism, with Doug Wilson's Canon Press. And Stephen Wolfe is a political philosopher. I believe he has a PhD in political science, actually. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I believe that is the case. And with that, combined with the Moscow movement and with everything that was going on in various political circles where these people were claiming they were Christian nationalists, led to a lot more people online associating themselves with the Christian nationalist movement, or at least, tentatively sharing, what would you say? I don't know, beliefs, sharing agendas, sharing goals with people who would consider themselves to be Christian nationalists. And we ended up having very many leaders of the Christian nationalist group arise. Guys like A.D. Robles started claiming that they were Christian nationalists. The cross-politic guys started claiming they were Christian nationalists. These guys down in Ogden, Utah, like Eric Kahn, started claiming they were Christian nationalists. You had C.J. Engel saying he was a Christian nationalist. And you had questions arising from people who agreed in some respects, like, for example, Dr. James White. He would say, of course, the secular project has failed. Of course, a state needs to acknowledge the one true creator, the one true God, the one true source of morality in its legal documents and its foundational documents. The founders knew this, although they knew it maybe to a lesser extent than James is comfortable with. I'll comment for myself on that in just a moment. But of course, James was also worried about things like sacralism, which is the uniting of church and state. He was concerned with certain positions that came out of Stephen Wolfe's camp, and in fact from Stephen Wolfe himself, regarding whether or not we need a revival in the country before we can have a Christian nation, right? And concerned with things like the punishment of Baptists, 300-400 years ago, when there were actually state churches. That's the whole reason the Puritans came to this continent in the first place. And then this issue started being complicated by various other issues, right? For example, who do we consider a Christian when we use that phrase Christian nationalism? Do we consider heretical groups that accept the name of Christ? Are they Christian? Can they be part of the Christian nationalist camp, or groups of disputed hereticalness, if that's a word, right? Lumping those two categories into one category, and people would variously say SDAs, Seventh-day Adventists, for those who don't know the acronym, Oneness Pentecostals, right? Catholics, Orthodox. Of course, you have groups like Mormons and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Who gets a seat at the table? More on that in a minute. Also, does the state have the authority to distinguish between who gets a seat at the table? More on that in a minute. So that issue came up. You had issue of what exactly constitutes nationalism, right? Are we a ethno-state? Is America to be ethno-nationalist? Is it okay to be ethno-nationalist even if America itself isn't an ethno-state? Of course, you have issues like, does ethno-state mean that it must be a racial state? And that kind of issue came up. How do we deal with issues like Israel and Jews? That kind of issue came up. And with those came up various issues like racism and anti-Semitism and stuff like that. What exactly constitutes racism and anti-Semitism? Those started coming up. Obviously, the Trump election became a big part of this whole thing, because on one end, you have very many people, myself included, who did not vote for Donald Trump because he is far too godless, frankly, and he's also not a conservative, quite frankly, right? But nevertheless, and you had various other people who were aligned with the Christian nationalist camp who actually did vote for Donald Trump, saying that, you got to be politically savvy and make these certain moves and yada, yada, yada. There was issues of anons and reviling and what exactly constitutes good Christian behavior. How many compromises are we allowed to make as Christians in the political sphere? And all these different issues arose. And to make a long story exceptionally short, you now have a big battle in the Christian nationalist movement between guys who we might describe as Wolfian, that would be in Stephen Wolf's camp, and guys who we might describe as Wilsonian, that is guys who would be in Douglas Wilson's camp. And then you have a lot of other guys who we might consider, I don't know who would attach these guys to. James White, I guess, is a representative of us, and I say us because I'm a part of this group, who are not exactly sure what to do with the whole thing, right? Not exactly sure, would we consider ourselves Christian nationalists or not? I mean, there's a lot of good points they make. There's a lot of terrible points that they make. So that's a little brief, far too simplistic rundown of the history of this Christian nationalist movement. And with all that context being laid out, I want to go ahead and give a couple of my thoughts on Christian nationalism, which I don't know if I've ever done or if I've ever done as explicitly as I am going to do today. So first off, let's break apart the two words here, right? So that we can come to a pretty solid understanding of what we mean by a Christian nationalist, right? So, Christian. First off, what is a Christian, right? And I would argue that Christians are obviously, those who believe in Christ. There's no doubt about that. Those who accept the gospel, right? So, but are groups like Catholics considered Christians? Are groups like Seventh-day Adventists considered Christians? Are groups like Oneness Pentecostals considered Christians? Are groups like, Arminians, Provisionists, Mormons considered Christians? Where do we draw the line, right? In other words, if the nation is to be Christian, what does that mean? Does it mean that the nation generally accepts Christ? In which case, technically Muslims consider Christ to be a Messiah. If you say, okay, well, yeah, but that's too extreme. We're obviously not talking about them. Okay, well, Jehovah's Witnesses believe, Christ to be Messiah. Well, yeah, we're obviously not talking about them. Okay, well, Mormons do consider Christ to be divine. Okay, we're not talking about them. Oneness Pentecostals consider Christ to be Yahovah. Are we talking about them? Seventh-day Adventists or Trinitarian, are we talking about them? You know what I mean? Like, so what is the nature of this state, if indeed we want the state to be Christian? And so that's the first thing I think needs to be properly addressed here. Now, for my money, and I'm fairly big tent when it comes to Christianity in some ways, and in other ways, I'm fairly narrow tent. I believe in order to be a Christian, in order to be rightly defined as a Christian, you have to accept the following truths, right? Number one, there is one God, of course, right? We are monotheistic. Number two, that one God is the God of the Holy Bible, Old Testament and New, the God of Israel, Yahovah, or Yahweh, if you believe that is the proper name, right? Number three, he is the only God, as we already said, which means he is the sole creator of everything. He created the universe. He is the uncaused first cause, right? Morality comes from him. Truth comes from him. Love comes from him, etc. He's the grounding of all abstracts, right? In other words, everything that is entailed by point number one is point number three, right? Number four, the God is understood to be triune. That is to say, he is understood to be Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Now, I use the word triune. Some might take objection with that because technically a Oneness Pentecostal could affirm that God is triune. They would just not affirm that he is three persons. I'm not going to get into a theological dispute per se, but that's the word I used. I'm sticking to it. Okay. He came down to earth physically as Jesus Christ. The Son came down to earth physically as Jesus Christ. He was both 100% God, 100% man. He lived a sinless life. He died on the cross for the remission of sins. He resurrected on the third day. And any and all who believe on his name and submit to him as Lord which of course he is Lord anyway, you're just simply acknowledging the truth at that point, will be saved by grace through faith alone. Okay. Those things need to be accepted in order to be considered a Christian. So you need to be a monotheist. You need to believe in the infallibility of Scripture. You need to believe in the Old and New Testament. You need to believe that God is Father, Son, Holy Spirit, that he is Jehovah, that he is the God of Israel, that Jesus Christ was 100% God, 100% man. You need to believe the 5 solas, right? Which in my opinion would mean if we're talking about a Christian state, we can't be talking about a Catholic state. Okay. So that's the first thing I want to address here, right? The second element of this is, of course, nationalism. So what is nationalism? And here I'm actually going to pull up a source so that you guys don't have to take my word for it. Okay. Nationalism definition. All right. Definition of nationalism. Identification with one's own nation and support for its interests, especially to the exclusion or detriment of the interests of other nations. Now, I would argue that that word detriment does not necessarily need to be there. One thing you'll notice when definitions use that word especially, right? And I actually just remembered my... Boop. Forgot this whole thing. When we use the word especially, that means that, excuse me, losing my train of thought here. Especially is not exclusively, right? Especially is not exclusively. So especially to the exclusion of other nations means usually, and you could say therefore that the word detriment here is perfectly fine, but not exclusively. In other words, you can still be a nationalist and not necessarily exclude other nations and not necessarily work to the detriment of other nations, right? In other words, to be even more broad with, or to be even more specific with that, you can have an identification with the interests of your nation, of your people, of your ethnic group, what have you, and not necessarily exclude the interests of other nations or be a detriment to other nations, other ethnic groups, other cultures, and again, what have you, right? But let's go ahead and read another definition here so that we can have multiple sources. Nationalism, according to Britannica. Ideology based on the premise that the individual's loyalty and devotion to the nation state surpasses other individual or group interests. Now, you may notice that these two definitions, what we just got from Britannica and what we got from Oxford Languages via Google, don't actually say the exact same thing, right? I could consider myself a nationalist according to the definition that was laid out by Oxford Languages. I could not consider myself a nationalist according to the definition that is laid out here. In my personal opinion, I would say, obviously, loyalty to Christ comes first. And in this case, we are talking about Christian nationalism. So the adjectival form of nationalism here is Christian, right? That's the primary identifier of this form of nationalism. So there is that. But beyond that, you know, to Christ first, but family obviously is going to come second, not the nation. And depending on how we define the word nation, I could even say people comes before nation, right? In other words, if nation is defined as the nation state, well, I can have loyalty to my people. And in fact, I would have loyalty to my people before I have loyalty to my nation state. And even that is going to be something that needs to be properly defined, because what do I mean by my people? Do I mean Americans? Do I mean white Americans? Do I mean Americans who are Jewish or Americans who are British, because I also have British blood? Do I mean Idahoans? I'm from Idaho, right? So what exactly do you consider your people, right? And this is an interesting question that we're going to have to address as we continue to debate issues of nationalism. What are my people? You know, one of the interesting things about America is we are not an ethno-state, right? There are certain states where this kind of question is very easily answered because they're ethno-states. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with an ethno-state, in my opinion, right? Ireland is a nation for Irish people. So it isn't, in other words, it is an Irish ethno-state, right? Israel is a nation for Jewish people. China is a nation for Chinese people, and specifically Han Chinese would be the people being, encapsulated by that definition there. France is for French people, Greece is for Greek people, Russia is for Russian people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? But there are certain nations, the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, in that it is multiple nations, that are kind of lumped into one, where you can't really say that we're a nation that operates as the political expression of a certain ethnic group, right? In other words, we're not all necessarily genetically related, right? I have, like I said, Jewish blood, British blood. I also have Scottish and Irish blood. There are going to be other Americans who have, German blood, Norwegian blood, French blood, and Russian blood, or Americans who are descended from various African cultures. I don't know a whole lot of African cultures, so unfortunately, I could name like Igbo or Swahili or something like that, but I don't know a lot of African cultures, unfortunately. There are Americans who are going to be descended from various Asian ethnos. There are Americans who are going to be descended from various Middle Eastern ethnos. So America conceptually is, we cannot really be an ethno state in that regard. Now, if one starts to play with the definition of ethnos a little bit, because a state, in my opinion, is nothing more than the sociopolitical expression of an ethnos. Notice I use the word ethnos. Well, ethnos means nation, right? And we are certainly a nation in that we are certainly a unique group of people. And I think the best way to define a unique group of people would be to look at a culture. There is certainly an American culture, right? Just like there is certainly a Russian culture, an Italian culture, a Jewish culture, and so on and so forth. Now, the American culture is, again, going to be unique comparatively to other cultures in that we are a melting pot, but every other culture is going to be unique comparatively to other cultures as well. There are certain factors each culture has that are different from any other culture, right? There are certain things about Canada that are unique to Canada, and there are going to be certain things about France unique to France, and certain things about America unique to America, and Russia unique to Russia, and so on and so forth, right? So no issue there. But if we define the word ethnos in that sense, right, if we define the word ethnos as just a nation or a group of people, a culture, right, then in that sense you can say that Americans are a people. And I would personally say that if you say I have loyalty to my people over and against my nation, as in the state, American should come first before any more individual subcultural group that might exist within the United States of America, right? In other words, I'm not Israeli. I might be of Jewish ancestry, but I'm not an Israeli, right? So I can have an America first perspective and not necessarily be contradicting my ancestry, but I can also celebrate my ancestry. We just celebrated Hanukkah, for example, right? So, anyway, let's look at another definition here of nationalism. I hope that whole little breakaway portion made sense to you guys. Dang, I've already been going for 29 minutes. That's crazy. Wikipedia defines nationalism as an idea or movement that holds that the nation should be congruent with the state. In other words, the people, right? Nation is a type of social organization where a collective identity and national identity has emerged from a combination of shared features across a given population, such as language, history, ethnicity, culture, territory, or society. So nationalism, according to Wikipedia, is the idea that that nation should be congruent with the state. And actually, I'd completely agree with that. Like I said, I think that at its core, a state derives its legitimacy from being the sociopolitical expression of a nation, right? A nation or an ethnos, in other words, a certain people group, right? Sometimes that is going to be an ethnic people group, sometimes going to be a linguistic people group, so on and so forth. But, this is why, like, for example, I made a post recently on Facebook for some of you guys who are friends with me on Facebook, talking about how either Messianic Jews are Jews or Israel has no right to exist. And for those who don't know, I believe Messianic Jews are Jews and that Israel does have a right to exist. But if Israel is a religious state, well, religions don't get states, peoples get states, right? If it is if it is to be considered a legitimate state, it has to be the sociopolitical expression of a certain people group. That people group is Jews. In the case of the Jewish people, they are an ethnic group, right? They share certain genetic factors and things like that. Obviously, you know, in order to be considered a member of that nation or someone who could immigrate to that nation, there's going to be certain, you know, elements that have to be addressed, like how Jewish do you need to be? And you could ask that for any other question as well, right? Like if you're descended from the Greeks, but your family has been in America for 300 years, well, does Greece need to accept you as a citizen? Well, no, obviously not, right? It's been 300 years since you've been there. But I digress. The point here that we're trying to make is to say, if Jews are a people, right, and in this case, I think an ethnic group, and as well as a shared culture, shared language, shared history, then Israel has a right to exist. But if that's true, Messianic Jews are Jews, right? And I'll probably do a video going more into depth on that some point in the future. But nevertheless, in that sense, of course, Americans are also a people. We are a nation, right? So we have a shared history. We have a shared language. In many respects, we have a shared culture. Although, as pointed out by Stephen Wolfe, we are kind of more akin to what the past referred to as an empire, right? In other words, you're not going to have the exact same culture in Texas as you do in California. It's related, certainly, but there's at least as much difference between the culture in Texas and the culture in California as there is the culture in Scotland and the culture in England, which are two different elements of Great Britain. Or if you want to be more broad than that and say two different nations, more broad, I guess is the right word. You could say the difference between Germans and Austrians, Liechtensteinese, I don't know what you call somebody from Liechtenstein, and people from Luxembourg, who, again, I don't know exactly what the ethnonym for somebody from Luxembourg is. And so on and so forth, right? So in other words, when we're looking at this term, this whole thing has been an attempt to define this term. What does it mean to be a Christian nationalist? Well, a Christian, if we define that the way I've defined it, as somebody who accepts the five solas, who accepts the gospel, in other words, somebody who is a monotheist, who believes in the God of Israel, Yahweh, or Jehovah, whichever name you prefer, somebody who believes Jesus Christ has come down to the earth and died for sins and resurrected, who was fully God, fully man, physically resurrected. All who believe on him shall be saved. All who submit to his lordship shall be saved, right? Excuse me. And what is a nationalist? A nationalist, we could say, given these three definitions and many others, we could say a nationalist is somebody who believes that the nation should be congruent with the state, and that one's loyalty to the state, at a bare minimum, should exist, and in some more extreme versions of nationalism, should be greater than one's loyalty to other groups, right? I hope all of this is making sense. I'll probably do much, much, much more content on this issue in the future. So given those definitions, can we say Christians can be nationalists? Can we say Christian nationalism is Christian? And do I identify as a Christian nationalist? Well, I certainly am an American nationalist. There's no doubt about that. I think that the state that is the United States of America, the federal government, right, should be congruent with the American people, right? In other words, with the utmost respect to immigrants, and I'm not anti-immigration. I think we should have limited immigration, certainly, and I'm definitely anti-illegal immigration, but I'm not anti-immigration, right? If you come through legal means, I have no problem with you being here. And in fact, give it a couple generations, and your posterity will end up being Americans anyway, right? In fact, you might end up being American anyway, right? If you come here and get citizenship, then you're an American. Nevertheless, where was I going with this? I lost my train of thought. Just a second. Let me get a drink of this water. Yes. With all due respect to immigrants, it's not your country, right? If you're from Mexico, Mexico's your country. If you're from Zambia, Zambia's your country. If you're from Afghanistan, Afghanistan's your country, right? So on and so forth. This country's for Americans. And that reflects certain, that belief of mine is reflected in certain other things which I believe. For example, I do believe in an America First policy. We should be concerned about America and American people before we're concerned about Ukraine or Israel or Saudi Arabia or whatever, right? That doesn't mean we necessarily are unconcerned with those people. It just means we should be concerned with ourselves first. It doesn't mean we have to be isolationist, but it does mean at the very least we should be non-interventionist, right? Also, it reflects in my belief that English should be the national language. We speak English here, okay? Obviously, you can speak Spanish. Nobody should throw you in jail for speaking Spanish. But if you want to be a citizen of this country, you need to learn the language, all right? It reflects in my ideas concerning immigration. As I said, I don't believe that we should be unfettered in our legal immigration. Obviously, illegal immigration is a problem, needs to be dealt with, right? If you're an illegal immigrant, you should be deported. Period. End of the conversation. If we want to, maybe if there's some illegal immigrants who have, and I'm not saying I support this. I'm just saying there's room for discussion here. If somebody were to say, hey, these illegal immigrants, they did commit the crime of coming here illegally. Since being here, they have not committed further crimes. Are we open to the possibility that they could become citizens? Maybe. And I only say that not because I am trying to be squishy on the issue, but because perhaps it is not feasible to deport 20 million people. If we only have to deport, say, 10 million, because 10 million of them, with the exception of coming here illegally, could end up being good citizens, are willing to learn the language, pass a civics test, pass a history test, pay taxes, all that other kind of stuff. Could we carve out an exception for them? Maybe. But either way, the illegal immigration problem needs to be solved. And I'm also not 100% down with that idea I just said. I'm just saying I'd at least consider the arguments, right? But nevertheless, I don't believe we should have a whole ton of legal immigration either. We should allow legal immigration. Obviously, as I said, if a Mexican comes here and he comes here legally and he becomes a citizen in this country and he learns the language and he adopts the culture, right? Then yeah, he's an American. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? That being said, though, do I want some massive number of the population to be foreign-born? No, I don't. Do I want some massive population of the nation to be loyal to another nation? Of course not. Do I want some massive number of the population to be somebody who doesn't identify with the American culture? No, obviously not, right? This is an American country for Americans. And lest anyone say, well, what is it? How does that work racially? Black people are Americans. Let's be very clear about that. Okay. Black people are Americans. Black people have been here just as long as white people have. They're Americans, plain and simple. Right. So we're not talking about that. And even a large deal of Latinos and Asians and so on and so forth are also just Americans. I don't think that we should be a racial state, in other words. Right. So let's just get that out of the way. I know I've already said that by saying we shouldn't be an ethno state, but nevertheless. So, to the second part of that, I'm an American nationalist, and that reflects in various things I believe. I'm a Christian. Does that make me a Christian nationalist? Well, there's a couple other issues we have to address there, right? First of all, how Christian should the nation be? I do think that the nation should reflect Judeo-Christian values, and I just use that phrase to say traditional Protestant values, okay? Maybe I should just say that so I don't trigger anybody, right? Traditional Protestant values. The state should reflect that to some extent, right? And again, this goes back to this belief of the nation should be congruent with the state, right? So, as an example, I am perfectly fine with a nativity scene or the Ten Commandments being displayed on government property. And conversely, I am not fine with a Baphomet statue or with a Hanukkah. Well, I guess that one can be a little... Hanukkah, you don't have to celebrate it as a religious person. I celebrate Hanukkah just because of the heritage, right? And so you don't necessarily have to celebrate Hanukkah as a Jewish holiday. But anyways, a statue of Baphomet, for example, I'm not okay with that being on government property. I don't think it should be legal, frankly, because the nation is congruent with the state. The American people are a Christian people, in my opinion, or at least that's the way it was originally, right? And Christianity's true. There's also that element. That's a big element of this whole thing. Christianity's true, right? Satanism isn't. Buddhism isn't. Islam isn't. Judaism isn't, right? So am I comfortable with a state where we display the 10 Commandments on government property or in schools, where we display a nativity scene on government property or in schools, but we don't display Baphomet statues or something Islamic or related to the Judaic religion or statues of Buddha or stuff like that? Am I comfortable with that? Yeah, actually, I think that's the way it should be, frankly. We're a Christian nation. Nothing wrong with that, right? So I'm at least comfortable with some level of Christianity, but now that gets that back to that question, how much Christianity, right? How much Christianity should be associated with the state? All right, what about prayer in school? Well, I don't know if I think public schools should exist anyway, but let's just assume that they do, right? Do we think there should be prayer in school? Yeah, I think so. I think I'm okay. I think I'm comfortable with that. I think, train up a child in the way you should go and you shall not depart from it. I don't have an issue with that. Should we compel students to have to pray? Well, no, because some students may not share our religious persuasions. And if they want to opt out of a teacher-led prayer, that's perfectly fine. Should a teacher be able to opt out of that prayer? I don't think so. I don't think that if you're not comfortable leading a class in prayer and we've decided that that's the way we're going to run our society, well, then maybe you should have another job. You know what I mean? So I'm comfortable with that. Am I comfortable with teaching creationism, even if it's alongside evolution in schools? Absolutely. Am I comfortable with acknowledging Christ in the preamble of the Constitution or in the Pledge of Allegiance, right? And saying things like, "In God we trust," or saying things like, this is the Declaration, but we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Saying things like one nation under God, indivisible. Totally comfortable with all that kind of stuff. And I'd even go further. I think we should add that section of the Declaration of Independence that says we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. I actually think we should add that to the preamble of the Constitution, personally. And I think we should add a qualifier as to who that Creator is. I think we should say we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator, Jesus Christ, with certain inalienable rights. I have no issue with that whatsoever. So we're moving along. How comfortable am I with the nation? How much Christianity am I comfortable with the nation adopting? I am comfortable with displays of Christian culture on government property. I am comfortable with saying, no, we will not display other religions' symbols on government property. I'm comfortable with prayer in schools. I'm comfortable with creation being taught in schools. I'm comfortable with in God we trust, one nation under God, acknowledging Jesus Christ in the Constitution, acknowledging God's law in the Constitution. I'm comfortable with all that kind of stuff. So can we take it a step further? Am I comfortable with legislating Christianity? And that's where I would draw the line. No, I am not. I think Protestantism, and Protestantism, in my opinion, just being a genuine reflection of Christianity, Protestantism has within its tradition, and this is true, I think, because this is within the Christian ethic, a understanding that people are free in matters of conscience, right? So would I be comfortable with the state legislating Christianity? No, absolutely not, right? You can't compel somebody to give up their atheism or their Islam or their Judaism. You can't punish somebody with like an excess tax or something like that to become a Christian, right? You can't execute heretics. I don't think we should be allowed to do that. I don't agree with blasphemy laws, right? I don't love that South Park has a episode or numerous episodes where they portray Jesus in an offensive way. I don't like that. I don't think the state should tell them they're not allowed to, though, right? If Comedy Central says we're not going to air you, that's one thing. If they are convinced in their own hearts we're not going to insult the Lord, that's one thing. If you decide you're not going to watch it, that's one thing. But if you say the government should actually do something about it, put them in jail, fine them, what have you, I'm not comfortable with that. I'm not comfortable with that. I think that leads to dangerous places. Okay, so we're not comfortable with the government legislating Christianity, and I already said I'm not comfortable with the government defining heresy either, right? I don't want the government saying, making this distinction of, hey, Seventh-day Adventist, not Christian, Southern Baptist, Christian. I don't want that. I don't think that that's okay, right? Now, to some extent, I guess they have to do that in the sense that I don't think we should have, Catholic Virgin Mary statues on government property. We're a Protestant nation, after all. But in terms of they are defining who is and is not Christian, no, I'm not comfortable with that, right? Do I believe that the state should disallow public portrayals or expressions of non-Christian faiths or heretical Christian faiths? No, I do not think the state should disallow those things, right? So then this now gets us back to this question, right? So how am I trying to word this? If we were to call ourselves Christian nationalists, what exactly does that mean? We already said, yes, I'm a Christian, judging by the definition that you gave, CJ. Yes, I'm a nationalist, judging by the definition you gave, CJ. Does that mean I'm a Christian nationalist? Well, if all you mean is the state should acknowledge Jesus Christ and we should have certain expressions of our Christian faith at the state level, for example, swearing on a Bible, having nativity scenes on government property, prayer in school, teaching creationism, and acknowledgement of Jesus Christ in the preamble of the Constitution, right? Then sure, I guess I'm a Christian nationalist, right? If you mean something along the lines of, well, you should give a preference to Christianity in so much as, yes, nativity scene, yes, church bells, no statue of Baphomet, no call to Muslim prayer, then yeah, I guess I'm a Christian nationalist in that regard. Now, I would immediately point out that that's no different than what the founders believed, right? With the exception of, I guess, Thomas Jefferson maybe would not believe that. But certainly Franklin would have believed that, even though he himself was a deist. George Washington would have believed that. Noah Webster would have believed that, right? John Jay would have believed that, etc. Patrick Henry, John Adams, Samuel Adams, they all would have believed exactly what I just articulated. So at that point, I would ask the question, what's the difference between constitutionalism and Christian nationalism? So that's something that needs to be addressed, right? But again, if that's all you guys mean, then yeah, I guess I'm a Christian nationalist, because I am a nationalist, I am a Christian, and I do believe that since Christianity is the true religion, and since we as a people are Christian, that there should be certain expressions of that at the state level, right? So, okay. Fair. But if you mean something beyond that, if you mean, no, the state should actually legislate Christianity, the state should actually give penalties to non-Christians for being non-Christians, the state should disallow the building of mosques and synagogues within our borders, the state should pass blasphemy laws and heresy laws, or have a definition of who is and is not a Christian, or should merge with the church, or whatever, right? Any of those. Well, if that's what you mean, then no, I'm not a Christian nationalist. We tried that. It sucked. It sucked really, really bad, actually. It got Christians killed. And frankly, it got people who were not Christians killed. And I don't think just because you're not a Christian, just because you're an Orthodox Jew, does not mean that the state should torture you, kill you, beat you up, and persecute you in some way, right? Now, here in the United States of America, for the most part, we have avoided that. I say for the most part because, and I'm only talking about after we were established as a nation. Obviously, I know, Baptists were flogged in Virginia, but that was before we were an established nation. At least I'm not aware of that happening after we were an established nation. The only example of true religious persecution I can think of in this country is what happened with the Mormons. And even then, that's a complicated matter, right? Because obviously they were polygamous. which is a crime, right? We don't recognize polygamous marriages in this country, nor should we, frankly. So, there's complication with that. But I don't think the Mormons were treated particularly well in Joseph Smith's time. There is a reason they fled to Utah. And that is while also acknowledging the Mormons did themselves no favors by, doing things like polygamy and by forming separatist groups in Utah, trying to form the Republic of Deseret and stuff like that, right? So that's a complicated issue in and of itself. But beyond that, we've done a pretty good job of not persecuting people of other faiths or people of heretical faiths in this country, despite being a Christian nation, even according to like the Supreme Court, for example. I can't remember the exact case, but Doug Wilson brings it up all the time. Some case, something or other versus Holy Trinity. And the Supreme Court was like, hey, we're a Christian nation. And that was, I think, 1892. But, somebody who is more knowledgeable about that can obviously let me know exactly when that was and the name of that and all that other kind of stuff. But we have seen persecution of Christians by other Christians and persecution of heretics by Christians and persecution of non-Christians by Christians in other nations which declare themselves to be Christian. So, and that's not something I want. That's something that, like I said, sucks. And we don't want that, right? There's also another issue here of nominalism, which we also don't want, right? I remember looking at a statistic. It was a Pew Research statistic that said something like 90% of the population of Iceland was considered to be a member of the Church of Iceland, but also 74% of the population of Iceland didn't believe that there was a God, right? That's a joke. Like that's the most farcical nonsense I've ever heard in my life. How is it possible? Because at the bare minimum, obviously all 10% of those people, or we can assume all 10% of those people who are not members of the Church of England don't believe that there's a God. But that means at a bare minimum that 64% of the population of Iceland is both a member of the Church of Iceland and also not a theist, let alone a Christian. That's absurd, right? That's absolutely absurd. And as somebody who genuinely believes in Christianity, I consider that to be a problem. Why? Because I actually am interested in the salvation of souls, right? I actually am interested in people coming to the truth. I don't want John from down the block to be considered a Christian because that's just what Americans do. I want John from down the block to be considered a Christian because Christ has truly regenerated him in his soul. He is under anointing of the Holy Spirit. He loves God, the one true God, not some other God, right? I don't want fake Christians. And if you're asking me the question, well, what would you prefer? Would you rather John be an atheist or would you rather him be a fake Christian? I would absolutely prefer him to be an atheist 100% of the time because at least he's honest at that point, and at least there's no self-deception at that point. And at least there's no, defense of if I'm trying to convince him of the truth, he gets just, well, I'm baptized in the Church of Idaho or whatever. And I like that, right? That's not a good thing. People should not be compelled in matters of conscience, whether that be by force of the state or by mere cultural norm. Okay? I generally believe in God, yada, yada, but I don't believe any of that Christ stuff. You're not a Christian. And that's not a good thing. And if people want to say, yeah, but it makes the society better. Really? Does it? Iceland's one of the most liberal countries in the world. Norway, one of the most liberal countries in the world. Sweden, one of the most liberal countries in the world. These all have state churches. Britain arrested Tommy Robinson for criticizing Islam. Britain has a state church. The King of England, Charles III, is the head of the Church of England. And yet England arrests people for criticizing Muslims. So are you sure that cultural Christianity is better? I'm not. I'm definitely not. And I'm 100% positive that sacralism is not the answer. So this all now gets back to the question, are we Christian nationalists? And certainly not Wolfian. For those who don't know, Stephen Wolfe does not believe that a Christian nation must be made up of Christian people. He believes cultural Christianity and nominal Christianity is enough. That's his words, not mine. Okay? So certainly not a Wolfian Christian nationalist, And certainly any of those people who believe in sacralism, no. And certainly any of those people who attach certain racialist elements to their Christian nationalism, no. Right? But if all you mean, like Doug Wilson likes to say, if all you mean is that we're nationalists, we're Christians, and we believe that the state should in some way reflect the Christian faith, number one, because Christianity is true, and number two, because we are a Christian people. And if you add the caveat there, as to Wilson's credit, he does, that a Christian nation at a bare minimum needs to be a nation made up of Christians, right? In other words, genuine regenerate Christians. There needs to be a work of the Holy Spirit in revival in this country, right? Then I guess, sure, I'm a Christian nationalist. But I don't see how that's any different than just saying I'm a traditionalist conservative of the constitutionalist variety, right? In other words, I don't know what separates on one end the Pat Buchanans and Russell Kirks and George Washingtons of the world from this modern expression of Christian nationalism. And maybe it is that nothing does. Maybe you guys would like to tell me, well, actually, that's exactly what we mean, is just a return to where we once were. That could be. That could be. I'd certainly like to see a clarification there if that's the case. Right? I don't know what the use of this term is then. To me, if all's you mean by Christian nationalism is constitutionalism as understood by the founders who themselves were largely Christian, although not all of them, then I don't know what the purpose of having this term is. But I can say definitively, granting that the Wilsonian side of Christian nationalism is unique compared to the Wolfian side, and that there is a good deal of agreement between people like myself and people like them. Granting that, I can absolutely say this sacralist, nominalist version of Christian nationalism, which seems to be the dominant strand, is not something that I believe Christians can associate themselves with. It's just simply not. Okay? If we are genuine Christians, then we cannot be Christian nationalists in the Wolfian sense. And by the by, that is not even to say that Stephen Wolf doesn't have some good things to say, because I've listened to quite a bit of him, and the dude's brilliant. I mean, he's a brilliant political scientist. He's got certain things to say that I think are important, but there's so much poison in them that I'd really prefer you get those from somebody else, in my opinion. Maybe Stephen Wolf will have a conversation with me one day. I've reached out to him before, and maybe this will all turn out to be a big misunderstanding. I kind of doubt it, because I've watched a lot of what he has to say. But nevertheless, if you don't believe that a Christian nation at a bare minimum is a nation made up of genuine Christians, then you're not a Christian nationalist in any true sense of the term. And if that category, people who don't believe, people who just believe cultural nominal Christianity is good enough, is what it means to be a Christian nationalist, well then I'm not. I'm simply not. And frankly, I would also point out here that if a Christian nation is at a minimum a nation made up of Christians, and if being a nation made up of Christians is not what a Christian nationalist means by a Christian nation, then a Christian nationalist is in fact not a Christian nationalist, right? Because you're essentially saying, I can have a Christian nation without having a nation made up of Christians. Which is a little bit like saying, I can be black while simultaneously being turquoise. I can be up while simultaneously being down. I can be Y while simultaneously being not Y. Right? It's a contradiction. So all of this to say, I hope this all made sense and I wasn't rambling anything like that. I'm going to do a lot more videos on this topic in the future, because this split between the Wilsonian version of Christian nationalism and the Wolfian version of Christian nationalism is, I think, going to become a little bit more important as time goes on. Both of them are growing. The Moscow movement is growing, and also Stephen Wolf's version of Christian nationalism is growing. There is also a general consensus developing amongst genuine believers in Christ that we've lost the culture war, and that secularism is a failed experiment, right? So we're going to have to start having these conversations more and more. In fact, I actually have a good friend. You guys may know him. I think I've actually name dropped him already. in this video. But nevertheless, my good buddy Nicholas, proclaimer of Messiah, has reached out to me, and unfortunately I haven't gotten back to him, but he's reached out to me about like maybe we should start a history channel talking about history first off as it truly is, not with all the propaganda involved, but also from a Christian perspective, right? That kind of thing is going to become more and more and more important as time goes on, which means government from a Christian perspective is also going to become more and more important. Philosophy from a Christian perspective, economics from a Christian perspective, right? Paul says, whatsoever you do, do all to the glory of Christ. That means literally everything. That means philosophy, science, history, writing fantasy fiction, rapping, making music, rock music, watching television, marrying, all of it. When you barbecue your chicken, you do it to the glory of God. I know that sounds funny, but I'm not kidding. You know what I mean? So this conversation, not only because of the Wilsonian-Wolfian split, and not only because of the failed experiment of secularism, but also just because of the fact that we are Christians, we are trying to dedicate everything that we do to God, not in a Canaanian way, but in a Mosaic way. In other words, not because we want to show him our great works, but because he has saved us, and we owe that to him, right? We owe him our first fruits. So in other words, I'm going to be doing a lot more videos on this topic. But this was just a very brief, not planned, not well thought out even, overview of the Christian nationalism issue. And I thought I was going to get to some other things I wanted to comment on, but there's just really not a lot of time. So yeah, let me know your guys' thoughts. Let me know if I made any sense or if I rambled a little bit too much. I'll write out my thoughts to this at some point and give you guys a more structured version of what I believe in this regard. I'm not going to promise that we're going to be, I'm going to try and do more watchdogs, but I'm not going to promise that we can, actually get you guys a good deal of these programs. But nevertheless, let me know if I made sense. Let me know if my definitions of Christian and nationalism work. Let me know, what you think about this video generally. But this is about all we got for today. It's all she wrote. It's all he wrote, I should say, because God is sovereign and writes out everything. I might as well just finish this. It's just water, guys. Don't worry. I'm not drinking coffee at 8:30 at night. Anyways, if you like this video, please remember to like and share this video and consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Hit the bell to get notified every time we go live. Questions, comments, criticisms, concerns, critiques, anything like that in the comment section down below. Follow me on various social media platforms. If you want to support the work we do on Patreon, you can do so. It helps me, with the income so that I can actually do more of this journalistic kind of work. Yada, yada, yada. You know the drill, right? Yeah, that's basically all I got today. Hope you guys enjoyed. Want to remind you to be vigilant, to be watchdogs, think like a Neanderthal, as we say, right? And if the Lord wills and tarries, we'll see you guys here soon.